No.
Okay, guys, welcome. This is part two to panel upgrades. All right. So part one was makeup. Okay, we had dedicated branch circuits that we ran, and we did a makeup lab. All right, up to the amount of circuits that you allow your students, something around 10 or so. Okay. Now part two involves actually running grounding and mounting a service panel. But prior to doing so, we've had a material takeoff list lab. Okay, so the material takeoff list lab is a lab that's in our solar module. Okay, and it's there for us to be able to dictate how much a panel upgrade costs. Okay, now before I start this mod, or excuse me, this lab, I like to tell my students the breakdown of doing a panel upgrade. Okay, the steps required. For instance, all right, those of us that have done panel upgrades, we know that we have to call for a meter spot prior to doing so. Okay, and we cannot do a panel upgrade without a permit, first of all right, and secondly, the reason for the meter spot is so we know whether it stays in the same location or not. Okay, so the material list that you've been doing with your students is based on the location staying in the same spot. Okay, but there are instances where the meter may be relocated. Okay, so Edison, DWP, they will give you your meter spot prior to you starting your job. This is something you want to mention to your students. Yes, they're apprentices. They're not going to be doing panel upgrades right off the bat, obviously alone. Somebody has to walk them through that, hold their hand through it. Okay, so what I want to get down to my students is the proper material we're going to be using. So if you can turn your attention over to this side. First of all, we have a meter service panel. Okay, this service panel has a maximum height. What I like to do is give out a meter spot, first of all, that I've used, because most meter spots will give you the standard height. Okay, they will give you the standard height and minimum height, which is 6 feet and 3 inches for the center of your meter. Okay, so our panel prior to mounting has to be maximum 6 feet and 3 inches to the center of the meter. Rule of thumb, main breaker has to be eye level. Okay, so typically we have two groups attacking this lab at once. Okay, we have two service panels, which we'll show you in 1 second as well after we go through this one. All right, first of all, prior to doing the grounding, which we'll go through in a second, we have the students mount the service panel according to one of our meter spots or any meter spot. Okay, obviously our riser can't go beyond a certain point. Okay, but in a meter spot, it shows you the distances for the unistruts. Okay, the unistrut is there to support your riser. We have unistrut that is supporting our riser here. On this plywood, we've used wooden screws. Okay, by code, you're not allowed to use wooden screws to mount a service panel or unistruts. You have to tell your students that they have to use minimum 3 by 8 inch by 3 inches lag bolts. Okay, that is the minimum requirement. All right, we might not be using it in our class, but they have to know and see the difference. Show them in a Google picture what those bolts look like. All right, and one side of this service panel is not going to sit 16 inches right to the center. Okay, the screws are going to be closer. What does that mean? That means one side is shallow and there is no stud. So you have to mount 3 by 8 by 3 inch toggle bolts. Okay, the toggle bolts open like butterflies behind the stucco. Okay, so this is part of also the material list that you've gone through with your students. Number one. Number two, we've mounted our panel. Fine. I have one pair of students working on mounting the panel. The second pair doing the grounding. All right, which grounding is a class that you should have, well, your student should have gone through in 120. So before I go through the riser and weatherhead, if you want to take a look at how we've done our grounding, bring it closer. Our grounding is obviously tied into our panel here, and then it drops down to the first ground rod within 6 feet of the panel. Okay. Also, you might want to dictate to your students, it has to be penetrated, obviously, 8 feet. Now, the meter spot may also show a concrete pad. Some cities require a concrete pad. Why? Because there can't be grass here when someone comes to service the panel. So a 36 by 36 concrete pad is required. Now what I did here, I have my grounding, my ground rod, okay, my double ground rod clamps, and then through the back, students have wired number 6 armor shield, but it has to be number 4 armor shield for 200 amp service, and it leads back to the front, to the second ground rod, which could be, in theory, 70, 80, 90, 100 feet away, depending on where the main cold water is. Okay, because this second ground rod can be within 6 feet of the first, okay, or like I said in my grounding video, I like to put it right in front. When the inspector walks in, he sees my grounding, linked to my cold water at the end. Everything is nice and strapped, okay, properly clamped. Bare copper is right in the middle, okay, ending at the cold water, which is a single clamp. It's also different. Single, this is a double clamp. You have to differentiate that. Single clamp for main cold water, double for standard ground rod, okay? Now, coming back here to our panel. One set of students you can have working on the ground rod portion, okay? Have them installing the ground rod, running the ground armored shield cable, another set working on that ground rod, and finishing up with the cold water, while another set of students is mounting the service panel and working on the riser. Now obviously they have to have their hard hats on, okay? The riser needs to be minimum 36 inches to 42 inches above roof line, okay? So minimum 3 feet, your riser has to be above your roof line. On top of that, you need at least 36 inches of slack. Now, the meter spot is gonna be different depending on how many stories your home is. It may be a 2-story home, it may be a single-story family dwelling, okay? We're gonna go based off of a single story. Here, obviously, our riser can't go all the way up because we have an air duct, okay? But you have to tell your students that this portion is your roof and it needs to be 36 inches minimum sticking up. On top of that, your feeders, service feeders, which after you've demoed your existing panel, you've installed your new panel, reconnected, landed all the existing circuits, installed the riser, your last steps are going to be installing the weatherhead and feeders, okay? Which also, keep in mind, have to be towards your drop. Your service weatherhead is always going to be towards your drop. Okay, this is something that the students have to know how to work on. Okay, installing a weatherhead, bending the wires properly. Okay, try not to crack your weatherhead. Dictate the difference between a 2-inch weatherhead and a 3-inch weatherhead. Okay, and that our first piece is solid. What does it say on the meter spot right there? It's giving us a minimum of 1.5-inch rigid conduit for 200 amp service. Okay, it's stated in the meter spot, so you have to go off of what it's telling you. The inspector wants to see 1.5 rigid, you have to supply 1.5 rigid. He wants to see 36 inches sticking up the roof, you have to supply 36 inches, okay? And the feeders are obviously gonna go to your service drop, which, keep in mind, a certified electrician is going to be disconnecting this drop live, okay? This is something you might want to mention to your students, okay? Because they are going to be working live at one point. Yes, there's no load on this drop, but at the end of the day, it's still live and it's coming from the city. And if you don't cut that line properly, insulate it, fold it, okay, and place it away, it's still hot and dangerous, okay? At the end of the day, you're disconnecting a service panel and you have to reconnect it, re-energize it, okay, and give the homeowner their power back, okay? So, important things to cover in this scope, all right? Grounding has to be done, first of all, okay? Second of all, the panel has to be mounted properly, okay, according to the size that it's given. So, again, I'll run it over one more time. So this slab, you should be breaking it up into 2 groups, all right? One set of students should be doing the grounding, while another set is carefully mounting the panel on the proper height. After that, somebody should be working on the unistrut, okay? The unistrut needs to be at least 1 foot away. Code says within 3 feet, but here, well, we'll put it 24 inches, okay? That's what the meter spot is telling us. We'll put it at 24 inches, okay? Unistrut also is another key piece of material that you have to explain to your students that electricians are going to be working with non-stop, okay? With Unistrut, we don't just make or support our risers. We make stands, okay? We build, let's see, supports for disconnect switches, for switch gear, okay? We build kicks with Unistrut. Again, we use them for stands, for solar systems, for outdoor. Unistrut, it has multiple uses. One last piece I want to mention, you have to let your students know whether they're going to use shallow or deep channel, okay? So, lastly, I'll cover it. Ground rods, 2 of them, link it to your cold water service panel, have it up according to its correct height, which should be 6 feet and 3 inches to the center of the meter. Okay, explain to your students the process of calling for a meter spot prior to doing this job, okay? The reason I say so is because if the location changes, it becomes a more difficult job, all right? This becomes a junction box and you have to relocate all the circuits. But that will leave for another video, okay? Make sure they understand how high the riser needs to be, how much slack needs to come out, and at the end of the day, that it's gonna have to be re-energized with Polaris or split volts, okay? Lastly, I want to mention in this video, if this is not a new construction panel, if it's an existing panel you're upgrading, 100 amps to 200 amps, you do not have to install arc fault breakers, okay? It is existing for a reason. You have to label the existing circuits when you demo your panel because you're going to reconnect them and relabel that new panel, okay? So again, this is part 2 of panel upgrade. Narek Abrahamian from Reseda.